Many of us are familiar with the story in the Bible, in the Torah, of the speaking or the talking donkey. Bilam, Harasha, Bilam, who is a prophet of the nations of the world, was hired to curse, God forbid, the Jewish people. And even though God was not happy with his choice to go and curse the Jewish people, Bilam went anyway. And on his way, an angel tried to stop him. And the Torah says that Bilam was riding on his she-donkey, and the donkey took Bilam off the road into the sadeh, into the field. And so Bilam began to hit and strike his donkey. And then it goes on to say that they continued into a vineyard, and the donkey began to ram the foot of Bilam against the wall, and then again Bilam struck his donkey. And the third time it says that they were in an alleyway, and there was no place to go to the right or to the left, and the donkey again sees the angel of God with a sword in his hand, and he crouches down beneath Bilam, and Bilam again strikes him mercilessly and beats him up. And all of a sudden, Vayiftach Hashem es pi ha'asa, and God opens up the mouth of the donkey. What does the donkey say to him? Why did you hit me 3 times? And soon after that, the angel appears. And what does the angel say to the donkey? Or to Bilam, rather? The angel says to Bilam, why did you hit your donkey 3 times? And Bilam responds, I have sinned. Come the commentaries, and they explain, from here we see the prohibition of hurting one's animal, which is called Tsar Bal Chayim. And this is part of the general prohibition of Avim and Achai that we are going to soon discuss. The Torah tells us that a Noahide is not allowed to eat a limb that came from a living animal. And the law is that God gave Adam dominion over the animals and wild beasts. And what is the definition of dominion? That Adam is allowed to use the animals for his own work, for his own needs, but he's not allowed to kill the animal or eat the animal. However, according to most commentators, if the animal died on their own, Adam was allowed to eat from their flesh. However, he was not allowed to kill the animal, and he was not allowed to eat the limb of a living animal. Furthermore, after the Mabul, after the flood, God told Noah he's allowed to eat an animal. He's allowed to eat the meat, and therefore he has permission to kill an animal, but only to eat the animal. However, he should be considerate of how he kills and slaughters the animal, not to inflict additional pain, because even though he had the right to kill the animal, he had no right to cause animals to suffer or to inflict pain upon them for no apparent reason. And so the prohibition is that he's not allowed to eat Avim and Achai, a limb that came from a living animal. And the reason for this is, the Ramban says, because this brings pain to the animal. If you're going to pull off a limb while the animal is alive, the animal is going to suffer. You have no right to inflict pain on the animal. The Sefer HaChinuch says it's not so much about the animal, it's about the human. We don't want to train him to be sadistic. It's a terrible character to inflict pain upon God's creatures. But ultimately it's a commandment of the Torah, which means that even if the animal had an accident and he lost a limb, that limb is also prohibited because it fell off while the animal was alive. So therefore it comes out that if another animal bit the first animal, you may not eat that meat that the animal bit off from another animal. Or if the animal was ill and the limb fell off, you cannot eat that limb. Or if doctors even cut the limb off to save the entire animal, still no, you're not allowed to eat the limb of that animal. That is the prohibition of Eivah min Achai, a limb of a living animal. However, as we stated earlier, from the time of Noah onward, you were allowed to kill an animal to eat the meat, and furthermore, even for the skin of the animal. You have a right according to Torah, if you want to use the animal for clothing, for coats, for vessels, for utensils, to make spoons and forks, and to make boneware, you are allowed to use the animal because God gave man dominion over the animal. However, to remember at all times not to afflict the animal with pain that is outlandish, but rather to do this with mercy and to do it in the most proper way. Now, even though one is allowed to use animal flesh for clothing and to write holy books, like Sifrei Torah is written on the klaf, on the skin of the animal, still no, never ever is one allowed to use the human flesh or eat human meat. However, if a non-Jew dies, a Noahide dies, you may use the body for science and for remedy. Now, there are different laws pertaining to Jews, and therefore you should ask your local rabbi. But pertaining to Noahides, the body is allowed to be used for science and for remedy. However, at the same time, we must always remember that we may never disrespect the corpse, and always to treat it with dignity. So, to summarize, you may kill an animal to protect yourself, for the fur or the skin of the animal, to make vessels for the meat of the animal, for medicinal purposes, and for tests, and use animals for experiments. You're allowed to kill an animal for dog food. If it's your pet, your dog, so you're allowed to kill an animal so you have meat for your own dog. However, you may not cause pain in vain. Furthermore, if you have a horse or an ox, you're allowed to hit them to work for you, but again, to be careful not to do this out of rage, not to hurt the animal, rather to teach the animal. You are allowed to put poison around your house if there are animals that bother you or destroy your property. However, simply for sport is prohibited, and therefore bullfights, according to Noahide laws, are prohibited. You're not allowed to be a matador, and you're not allowed to kill bull. You can shech the bull and use the meat for barbecuing and having hot dogs and hamburgers, but to put a bull through such embarrassment and pain and suffering, this is prohibited according to the Noahide laws. One may hunt for animals. A Noahide is allowed to hunt deer and use it for skin, for clothing, and the meat to be eaten. However, it's problematic for a Jew, because if a Jew hunts a deer, he cannot eat the meat. So that's for another discussion. Furthermore, a Noahide is permitted to castrate an animal. However, it should be reserved only for select cases. For example, if you have a horse and you're concerned that the horse is not focusing on the road, but is constantly going into the fields, you're allowed to castrate the horse. But a Jew is not allowed to castrate his animal, and therefore how that is done, you should also ask your local rabbi. The Torah says in Leviticus that you shall not mate your animal into another species. And from here we see that it's prohibited to interbreed, not only for Jews but also for Noahides, two different species. For example, a dog and a wolf, or a deer and a goat, or a ram and a sheep, or a horse and a mule, or a mule and a donkey. Even in a case where they cannot be impregnated. In other words, even though no new species will come out of it, it's still a prohibition. So this is basically, in a nutshell, the laws of Eivrim Min HaChai, the laws of the prohibition of eating a live animal, or rather eating a live limb from an animal. And seemingly you cannot eat the animal when it's alive. That's also part of the prohibition, because that includes the prohibition of causing pain to the animal. Fish, however, you could pull out of the water and eat it without slaughtering it. Pertaining to the next concept, we're now going to discuss the Noahide law of dinim. Dinim means the mitzvah that Noahides have to establish courthouses and judges and policemen. It says in the Torah, in the book of Genesis, it says, "V'esdimchem l'nafsheseichem edrosh," that if you kill another person, God says, I will demand his blood. And therefore, when you spill the blood of man, through a man, your blood shall be spilled, because B'tselem Elikim asa Adam, in the image of God has God made man. So man is made in God's image, and therefore you may not murder another man, because by doing so you are murdering a piece of God. So the Gemara in the tractate of Sanhedrin, page 57, side B, says that from the words Shefich Dam Ha'adam, to spill the blood of man, this teaches us the prohibition that one is not allowed to be a murderer. And through man your blood shall you be spilled, teaches us that there has to be a witness who testifies. And then the Beth Din, the court of Noahides, has a right to punish that murderer through killing that person. We are taught in Ethics of Our Fathers that the world is sustained by judgment, by truth, and by peace. So the number one thing is judgment. If there are good judges, then you establish law. So what is the job of the judge? There are basically four areas where the judge is obligated to rule and teach. Number one is simply to warn the people, to tell the people not to do and not to violate the 7 Noahide laws. Number two is to punish. If you do violate it, there will be retribution. Number three, however, is to educate the people, to educate society. And that is to start with emunah, with faith, as we spoke about in the earlier classes and lectures, that every human being has the obligation and the mitzvah to believe in God. And in addition to believing in God and trusting in God, also to accept the yoke of God upon you. And that is, in simple terms, to know that there's an eye that sees and an ear that hears. And every action you do will either be rewarded if it's good, or if God forbid it's negative, it's going to be punished. And the job of the judge is to educate the people to follow the 7 Noahide laws, the 7 laws of Noah. And then there's a fourth area, and that is civil law. And these are laws that deal with torts and damages, the laws of watchmen. And we know that there are 4 basic watchmen according to the Bible, according to the Torah. There is the Shomer Chinam, the unpaid watchman. There's the paid watchman. Then there is the renter. If you rent someone's house, you are obligated to watch the house that it's protected. Or if you are a borrower, you borrow someone's car, you borrow someone's horse, you are also a watchman, a bailey. And we discussed this on another tape called Watchmen. So you can see the different laws pertaining to the 4 different types of watchmen. However, a Noahide does not have to follow the same laws as Torah law pertaining to the watchman. But they do have the obligation to make laws that are universal for that community, for that city, for that state, and for that country. If they choose to follow the laws of the Torah, they may do so. They have a right to follow Jewish law when it comes to torts and watchmen and holding back wages, etc., etc. But more importantly is that they are to establish these laws and to make sure that people uphold these laws. When it comes to loans, laws of seduction, laws of rape, how to handle these things, what the penalties should be. So these are the 4 basic areas that the judges are responsible to adjudicate and to teach and to uphold. Now, what makes a judge? How do you become a judge? Number 1, you have to be appointed a judge. You can't make yourself a judge. Number 2 is you have to be fit to be a judge. In other words, you have to have the knowledge of the laws. And number 3, you have to have a good character. What does it mean to have a good character? There are 7 basic character traits that a judge should have. Number 1, to be wise. Number 2, to be humble. Number 3, God-fearing. Number 1, to hate money. In other words, not to take bribes. Number 5, to love the truth. Number 6, to be respected and loved by people. And number 7, to have a good name. Now, it's very difficult to get a judge that has all of these 7 things, but to try to find a judge that at least fills most of this description. How many judges do you need to adjudicate a capital case? Well, in Jewish law, you need 23 judges. In the laws of Noahide, you only need 3 judges. Or even if one judge is a specialist or a professional in his field, that would be okay, but preferably there should be 3 judges. Furthermore, when it comes to Noahides, the judges may be related to the litigants, and the 3 judges may be related to each other. However, if there is love and hate between them, in other words, either they love very strongly one of the litigants, or they hate very strongly one of the litigants or one of the other judges, they should not sit together, and they should recuse oneself. Another interesting halacha is that Eid Nasadayi, when it comes to Noahides, a witness can become a judge. In other words, if a judge witnessed a murder, he happened to be standing in a bank and he saw a robbery and he saw one of the gunmen shoot somebody and kill somebody, and later they bring that gunman before him in trial, and he is the judge, he does not have to recuse himself, and he's allowed to be the judge on the case. Now, how many witnesses do you need to come before the judge? In Jewish law, you need 2. In Noahide law, you only need 1. However, who cannot be a witness? A witness cannot be a liar. A liar cannot testify. If we have proof that he lied in a previous case, or business people say, yeah, he's a liar, then he is not kosher to be a witness. If the witness violates the 7 Noahide laws, or even one of the 7 Noahide laws, he cannot be a witness. If he's a non-believer in God, I don't believe in God, I'm an atheist, you cannot be a witness. If he damages people's property or destroys other people's property, or he physically beats up people, he's a mobster, he is not kosher to be a witness. So these are the basic laws of judges and dinim. However, the Rebbe explains that part of the laws of dinim, of judges, also include, at least according to the opinion of the Ramban, Nachmanides, the laws of tzedakah, the laws of charity. The Gemara says clearly that the laws of charity are a mitzvah, are an obligation for a Noahide. And the Gemara brings a proof from a verse in Ezekiel, in Yecheskel, chapter number 16, verse number 49, and there it says, Hine zeh hoya avoin sedoim. Behold, says Ezekiel, this was the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, and that is v'yad ani ve'evyoin lo yachzika. She did not support and strengthen the hand of the poor, the destitute, and the needy. And that's why Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed. If Sodom and Gomorrah did not have the mitzvah of tzedakah, how could God punish them so severely? And therefore the Gemara says they were obligated to follow the laws of charity. And the Rebbe goes on to say that there is no contradiction between the following story. The Gemara says in the Tractate of Sanhedrin, page 109, side B, why did God punish Sodom and Gomorrah? Because of a riva, because of a young maiden. What was the story? There was a young maiden in Sodom who was very kind and very charitable, and she was giving food to poor people. When the judges of Sodom and Gomorrah heard about this, they judged her, and they said that because she has violated the laws of the country, which is to be kind to poor people, because in Sodom and Gomorrah you are not allowed to be kind or charitable to the poor, she will be punished with death. And the death was a very cruel death. What did they do to her? They tied her up on top of a roof. And on this rooftop, they poured honey over her entire body. And bees came and stung her to death. And since they were so evil and brutal, and because of their injuriousness, causing a slow and agonizing death, says the Gemara that God heard the cries of this young maiden, and he came along and he destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Now the Rebbe explains that even though they killed her, however, the initial sin was the violation of charity. And because, however, they were so severe in their verdict, therefore God punished them midah keneged midah. God punished them measure for measure. And we find another similar verse. It says about Yisro, the father-in-law of Moses. He heard what happened, and he came to the desert. He left his fancy palace and his beautiful home and his great job that he had in Midian, and he came down into the desert to live in a tent together with Moses. If you look into the Torah, it says when he met Yisro and he heard all the miracles that God did for the Jewish people, he says, now Ato Yedaiti, now I know, Ki Godel Hashem Mikol Elikim, the God is greater than all the other gods. Why? Because Kasha Zadu Aliyah. Because why? Because what the Egyptians tried to do to the Jews, God did to them. It's amazing. What inspired Yisro more than anything else was the fact that God was a just God. That God was a God that punished the Egyptians measure for measure. The Egyptians took the Jewish children and they threw the boys into the water. The Egyptians drowned the young children, the young Jewish boys, and therefore God drowned the Egyptian army. This is what Yisro saw to be God's greatness, measure for measure. And therefore, how much more so when we do a good deed, when we give tzedakah, when we're kind to the poor, when we respect our parents, when we respect our teachers, when we help people, we give people jobs, we're kind, we're nice, we're decent, how much more so God will reward us midah for midah, measure for measure, many, many times over. However, we have now a question. If God wants the nations of the world to give tzedakah, and it's a mitzvah, and we see clearly by Sodom and Gomorrah, because they violated this mitzvah, God turned over the entire city. So why do we find then the expression, v'chesed le'umim chatos? It says that kindness to the nations of the world is a sin. However, the Gemara already answered this verse. The Gemara in the tractate of Baba Basra, page 10, side B, says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. What does it mean, v'chesed le'umim chatos? That just like a korban chatos, just like a sacrifice, which is called a sin offering, atones for the Jewish people. In other words, if God forbid a Jew accidentally performed the sin, he violated a negative commandment in the Torah, so he brings now a sacrifice called a sin offering in the Holy Temple, and he's atoned for the sin. Similarly, a non-Jew today, through tzedakah, through charity, he gets the same credit for bringing this sin offering. So therefore we see that not only is it a mitzvah, not only is it an obligation for a Noahide to give charity, but also the charity that a Noahide gives is tantamount to the bringing of a sin offering in the Holy Temple. What does that mean? Perhaps the explanation is as follows. The Alter Rebbe writes in Tanya, Rabbi Shnei Zalman of Liadi explains in the letters of Tshuva that nowadays, being that there is no Holy Temple, and we cannot bring sacrifices to atone for one's sin, therefore one has a right to give more than 20% of their earnings to charity. In other words, even though the Talmud says one should give primarily between 10% to 20%, however, if God forbid you were sick and you had to go to the doctor, and the doctor says he has to perform a heart transplant, it's going to cost you $500,000, you're not going to say, well, I only make $50,000 a year, so I can't afford it. You're going to mortgage your house, you're going to somehow borrow the money, and make sure you do the operation because you want to save your life. A spiritual death is worse than a physical death. And therefore, for a spiritual death, a person has the opportunity and also the obligation to save his soul. And to do this is through giving charity to the poor. And to give even more than 20%. And by doing so, God will consider this to be a chatas. God will consider this to be a sin offering and bring you long life and health and tremendous blessing in this world and in the world to come. As we have explained in the previous classes, that every person who believes in God and is a kind person and follows the 7 Noahide laws has a place in paradise and has a place in the world to come. And that individual will be resurrected when Mashiach, when the Messiah will come. So therefore we should conclude by saying, Tzion b'mishpat hipadeh v'shaveh b'tzedakah. The Prophet tells us that Zion, through judgment, will be redeemed by making sure that the nations of the world will follow the 7 Noahide laws, including the laws of justice. And furthermore, through giving tzedakah, through giving charity to the poor, v'shaveha, then Jerusalem will be returned, and this will bring about the Geula, this will bring about the redemption, when the entire world will experience peace, as the Rambam says that God gave the Torah to the world to bring shalom, to bring peace to the world. And then when Mashiach will come and the 3rd temple will be rebuilt, then all the nations will flow to the Holy Temple. And they will talk one language, with one God, a unified world, with the coming of Mashiach speedily in our days.